and in MRes, in MRes, in
Yes.
entomology, yeah, in entomology from Imperial College London. He's a writer, speaker, amateur mycologist, and has a lifelong love of nature and wildlife, and has conducted research in various parts of the world, including the UK, Catalonia, Almeria, Texas, and the Peruvian Amazon, Vietnam, and Ethiopia. He also has experience working in the psychedelic field as a past scientific assistant to the director of Beckley Foundation, and currently as a collaborator with the Center for Psychedelic Research at Imperial College London. His research is focused on the capacity of psychedelics to reconnect humanity to nature for the potential betterment of humanity and the biosphere at large. So, very happy to have Dr. Sam Gandy with us today. If you have a question, we're going to use the raise hand feature. You can find that by clicking participants, and you'll see your name. And it's at the bottom. You can raise hand at the end. We'll have some time for discussion, and then it'll cut to you. You can ask your question. We'll go in order. And also, if you don't feel comfortable coming on the video, you can type a question into the question box, and we will ask that for you. So, thank you. And Sam, you want to take it away?
Cool. Happy to. Yeah. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for having me. So just to quickly provide a little bit of background context, because obviously ecology is a bit of a different area of science to sort of what I'm involved with now. But I think it's definitely related in that ecology is the science of living systems, of the interconnection of living systems, and it's the the detached objective scientific comprehension of that. Whereas psychedelics are related in that they are experiential direct tools of interconnection. So a different form of knowledge, from the detached sort of academic to the direct experiential. So two sort of different pathways to sort of interfacing and understanding this interconnection of humans with life and of life in a broad sense. So just to provide a little bit of more context of what I'm going to be talking about. So I think the concept of biophilia is useful here. So this was developed by famous biologist and also entomologist E.O. Wilson. The connections that human beings subconsciously seek with the rest of life. And there's this is an active area of research in terms of why humans are have this biophilia. And it might seem fairly obvious to some. We've spent 99.9% of our existence as a species living in natural environments, and the resources we need to survive were part of these environments. But biophilia extends beyond those things, and it's the appreciation for life that falls outside of seeming direct benefit to us. And the concept of the overview effect that some of the astronauts experience when viewing planet Earth from space. And this is a very powerful cognitive shift that can occur. It tends to be a permanent or really enduring shift in the people that experience it. And associated with experiences that are truly transformative experiences involving senses of wonder and awe, unity with nature, transcendence, and universal brotherhood. And I think there's a lot of commonalities here with the peak mystical type experiences that psychedelics can catalyze. And my view is that psychedelics can provide perhaps maybe more accessible, egalitarian way to a similar transformative viewpoint. It would be great to gift everyone with the experience of being able to see our planet from outside it, but I think we're some way off from that, unfortunately. So it's important just to define what I'm going to be talking about nature connectedness or relatedness a lot. And so these are two words for essentially the same thing, just depending on the type of measures that are being used. So nature connectedness is one's self-identification with nature, the experiential felt sense of oneness you have with the natural world. So it's something, again, direct and emotional. It's not an academic, knowledge-based view. It's something much more kind of empathic and emotional driven. And this nature connectedness has very important effects on psychological health. So there's a substantial body of research literature showing that people who rate highly in nature connectedness tend to also rate highly in various measures of psychological well-being, including vitality, life meaning, life satisfaction, positive effect and happiness, and lower anxiety levels. Nature connectedness is also an important mediator of some of the benefits of actually spending time in nature, so nature contact or immersion. And so these can include things like the perceived restorativeness of natural settings, well-being outcomes when attuned to nature's beauty, and also attentional capacity and restoration, subjective well-being, and also, interestingly, and sort of an interplay of nature connectedness with nature contact, people who rate more highly in nature connectedness following exposure or contact with nature tend to rate more highly in intrinsic aspirations. So things like community, self-growth, self-development, than extrinsic aspirations, things like fame, money, social status. Nature connectedness is, it's essentially quite a deep set view. It's not the easiest thing to change, as I'll get to. There's sort of a lack of interventions that can robustly increase nature connectedness in a sustained way. And it's partly as a result of one's childhood wiring. So childhood contact and exposure to nature predicts later life nature connectedness. So there is a need, I think, as we're growing an increasingly urbanized, nature alienated species, there's this need for interventions that can foster sustained nature connectedness. Another interesting and very important thing is that nature connectedness is a strong, if not the single strongest psychological predictor of pro-environmental behavior. So there's, through increasing nature connectedness, there's some serious, you get serious bang for your buck in terms of can bolster and increase the psychological health of individuals, but on a broader, potentially like planetary scale, there's this increase in care for nature on a wider scale. And that's important because we are in a mass extinction event that our species is orchestrating, and there is a notable lack of interventions to reduce humans' environmentally destructive behavior. And sort of just to zoom out beyond just the nature connectedness. So simple increased acknowledgement of nature seems to enhance psychological connectedness in a broad sense, including to people, nature, and life as a whole. And this is important, as psychological disconnection is associated with a range of mental health issues and illnesses, things like addiction and depression and PTSD. Whereas high level connectedness is improvements in connectedness are associated with the recovery of mental health. And so psychedelics, or some of them, have been used by various cultures, different parts of the world, for a long time. And it should be noted that some, like the Huichol Indians in Mexico, they probably have the single longest, most intact cultural use of a psychedelic, of the peyote cactus, going back sort of many centuries, millennia. And they they use natural settings are a very important part of their ritual use of peyote. And I should say that not all indigenous groups use natural settings for psychedelic experience, but some do. And also, I think interestingly, it tends to be for people using psychedelics naturalistically in the wild, outside studies. Natural settings tend to be a favoured environment by people. So just to kind of a little more on this broad level of disconnection, this seems to be an important part of what psychedelics can work on, is they can facilitate reconnection over disconnection. And this was something that my friend Dr. Ros Watts at Imperial discovered as part of her psilocybin major depression research, when she kind of assessed people who've been through the psilocybin trials with major depression 6 months later. She found that all of these depression sufferers had reported feelings of disconnection. And the antidepressants they were on, the SSRIs, had also been part of that. They'd also sort of yielded feelings of disconnection, and that the psilocybin experience worked in part by facilitating a reconnection to self, others, and the world at large. And it was interesting as well that some of the depression sufferers coming out of the psilocybin therapy and rediscovering nature, they hadn't really spontaneously mentioned feeling disconnected from nature prior to their psilocybin session. It was only during and after that they realized they'd been missing that and really valued having it. So just a few case accounts of how this connection might be experienced. So like Google Earth, I had zoomed out. For weeks afterwards, I was absolutely connected to myself, to every living thing, to the universe. This connection it's just a lovely feeling. This sense of connectedness, we are all interconnected. This is an early survey study conducted by my friend Dr. David Luke and a colleague, and this was sort of assessing the nature connection and ecological concern increase or decrease among various substances. So classical psychedelics, but a few other things in there as well. And yeah, from this research, it was definitely psilocybin mushrooms that came top of the pile in terms of increasing connectedness and ecological concern. I've spoken to, and I hope I'm allowed to say this, but Matthias Forsman, who's part of your Yale gang, as far as I know, and he has some unpublished data comparing different psychedelics like LSD, mescaline, and psilocybin. And he's also stated that this kind of aligns to what he found, that there seems to be something quite special about psilocybin in enhancing nature connectedness beyond perhaps even the other classical psychedelics. Ayahuasca and LSD are both sort of rating quite high here. And I think it's interesting to note that from the non-psychedelic research on nature connectedness, it seems that direct emotional engagement with natural settings it is a pathway to increase nature connectedness. And the thing about, say, LSD and psilocybin is they tend to be fairly user-friendly psychedelics in that they allow one to sort of take them and go out and explore natural settings. Because I would have thought maybe ayahuasca would have rated highly here than it did, but I think ayahuasca is a less user-friendly psychedelic. Like, people tend to do it, even if they're doing it in the rainforest in Peru, it tends to be the acute experience is taking place in a maloca or a ceremonial space, and the shaman will sort of keep you under his watch and not let you sort of go out and explore. Whereas people are much more prone, I think, to adventuring on LSD and mushrooms and getting out to nature. I think that is part of it. You can see here, ketamine has the opposite effect, rather sort of worryingly, like connection and concern radically decreasing. It's like an inverse psychedelic in that front. So yeah, ketamine users are not going to, ketamine fiends are not going to save the world by the looks of it here, in terms of ushering in a new ecological age of Aquarius. Ayahuasca users, I mean, it would be interesting, I think, to see more research on ayahuasca usage. So the principal research in terms of psychedelics and nature connectedness so far has been with psilocybin, and that obviously applies to the bulk of psychedelic research. Psilocybin is the current main focus. But I think phenomenologically and also chemically, like ayahuasca is fairly close to psilocybin on the psychedelic Venn diagram, certainly closer than mescaline or LSD. And yeah, it's sort of been found that ayahuasca users tend to rate more highly in this measure of self-transcendence. And this is sort of the experience or the feeling of transcending beyond the individual self and sort of feeling like one becomes part in a spiritual sense of the wider universe. And this is also a significant positive predictor of nature relatedness and environmental concern. So there's been a few different studies on both clinical and healthy populations of people using psilocybin. There was a study conducted by the von Weider team in Switzerland, and it was a study. It was pooling data from 8 different studies where psilocybin was administered to healthy volunteers, and they were looking at sort of like the acute short-term and long-term effects of psilocybin on these people. And one of the things they found was this: a third of all people undergoing the psilocybin sessions at 12 to 18 months later, a third of these people reported enduring changes to their relationship with nature and life as a whole. So enduring positive, and about the same amount also reported the same sort of like positive changes in aesthetic experiencing, and that the perception of beauty and aesthetics in nature is one of the pathways to enhance connectedness. So that's important. So, and this follows on to a study conducted by Taylor Lyons and Lyons Carhart-Harris of the Imperial group a few years ago. And this was a subsample of major depression sufferers. And it was a long-term follow-up, sort of 7 to 12 months later, after I think 2 doses of psilocybin. And these people also, there was a robust increase in people's nature relatedness. Now, there's a really important point here to make, in that this study and the previous data from the pooled studies, this psilocybin was administered in highly clinical environments. Cozy though they may have been, they were nature-deprived environments. And yet, in spite of that, people's connectedness to nature increased robustly in some people, and in an enduring, sustained way. So that's really interesting, because it's not that easy to shift people's baseline nature connectedness measures in a sort of like sudden, lasting way, and B, it seems to be happening outside of a natural environment, which is very unusual. There's a fair bit of literature showing that connectedness with nature can be kind of brought out with contact with nature, but not all the literature agrees with this. I was speaking to a researcher recently, and she said that it's maybe being underreported, actually, like the negative results. So just getting out into nature and passively interacting with it may not be enough to increase your nature connectedness, and certainly maybe not in a sustained, enduring way. It may increase it brief, like for a short term, and then sort of levels may drop. So this is quite interesting, and it sort of begs the question of what's the potential of administering psychedelics in nature-based settings, perhaps. So this was a really interesting study conducted by Matthias Forsman and a colleague, as I mentioned him before, and it was he found that lifetime experience with classical psychedelics in particular, and not other substances examined, predicted pro-environmental behavior change, and that the mechanism of that was through this increase in the self-identification with nature or nature relatedness. So as this sort of as the connection to nature increases, there's this sort of concomitant increase in concern for it. And another interesting thing is that that this increase in pro-environmental behaviour is also tied to pro-social behaviour, the intent to benefit others, and those are very strongly linked. You can't really increase one without increasing the other. So it kind of hints that there's this kind of externalizing of one's awareness as one becomes connected to nature. So one becomes generally more concerned about others as well. So this is some of my own research that I was involved with, and published a paper on Mars in December. And we sort of used a prospective survey to take data to look at people pre-psychedelic, immediately after, 2 and 4 weeks, and then I think two years later, to get sort of like a short and then longer term snapshot of people. And lots of data was produced from this survey, but we were just interested in the nature relatedness. And we got some quite nice data in terms of, like, this is total lifetime usage of psychedelics, so versus nature relatedness. So you can see on the x-axis on the bottom there is the total number of sessions with classical psychedelics, and then on the X you've got the mean nature relatedness at baseline. And so we got a very strong relationship here, where one's baseline level of nature relatedness was really strongly predicted by their prior total lifetime psychedelic use. We also found that for psychedelic naive people who'd never taken a psychedelic before, there was also a noticeable and significant increase in their nature relatedness. Echoing other previous research, we also found that there was, as nature relatedness went up, there was a concomitant increase in psychological well-being scores. The mechanisms behind this nature relatedness increase were importantly experiences of ego-dissolution. So experiences of ego-dissolution and increased nature relatedness have also been linked together in previous research, but correlative research importantly, whereas this was a prospective survey study. So, and we also found ego-dissolution was a positive predictor of increased nature relatedness, as was access to and the perceived importance of natural settings, which one might expect. But here's a few sort of little accounts of how this nature connectedness might be experienced. So before I enjoyed nature, now I feel part of it. Before I was looking at it as a thing, like a TV or a painting. You're part of it. There's no separation or distinction. You are it. I felt like sunshine twinkling through leaves. I was nature. So this is some very sort of fresh off the press and not even published yet data, but I just thought I'd just share in case it's of interest. So this was a talk given at Horizons conference last year in New York by an Imperial colleague, Taylor Lyons, and she's just wrapped up this what I think will be a very interesting study, the Imperial College Psilocybin Insight Study. So in this study, healthy psychedelic naive volunteers were given a high dose of psilocybin in a supportive environment, and then their brain was looked at before via MRI, and then immediately after, and then a month later. And then psychological assessments were conducted longer term. So it was looking at the sort of the acute and then long-term brain psychological and brain effects of psilocybin. And as you can see here, there was this robust increase in connectedness to nature, and that was still very much evident, and in fact higher. It was highly statistically significant, and also higher at the 3-month stage post experience. So again, this is interesting because there is, as I've mentioned, there's a lack of long-term nature connectedness interventions, and here, like 1 or 2 psilocybin experience seems to elicit this significant and enduring increase in measures of nature connectedness. It's also worth mentioning that one of the other things that psychedelics can catalyze a long-term shift in is personality trait openness. And of the big 5 personality measures, openness is most strongly associated with nature connectedness and also pro-environmental awareness. Part of what openness covers is aesthetics, sensitivity and appreciation for aesthetics, and the perception of beauty in nature, and the emotions that produces are an important pathway to nature connectedness. A never important trait that psychedelics have been found to increase is mindfulness, measures of mindfulness. And this is outside of a mindfulness meditation context as well. I mean, it definitely synergizes with the latter, but yeah, it seems they're capable of eliciting mindfulness in an enduring way, again, post-experience. And yeah, nature connectedness and mindfulness have a positively reinforcing synergistic relationship. So the more you are of one, the more you tend to be of the other. And mindfulness in nature, while having contact with nature, also seems to act as a mediator between connectedness and well-being. A never important thing just to mention is that relates to, I think, connectedness and the experience of psychedelics, the experience of being in nature, as well as, yeah, the ego-dissolution, mystical experiences that psychedelics can catalyze, is this experience of awe. Stimuli that are vast, that transcend current frames of reference, that require new schemata to accommodate what is being perceived. So essentially, the perception of a small self, of one being very small in relation to something much bigger. So in terms, just a brief to touch on the ego dissolution element of this enhanced nature connectedness. So this is a visual representation of brains under placebo and a high dose of psilocybin as assessed by a MRI, and these sort of different circles around the outside represent different brain regions. And so on a high dose of psilocybin, the default mode network of the brain, which contains a few different sort of controller hubs, becomes increasingly relaxed before sort of dissolving altogether. And sort of, yeah, one of the interesting things that happens here was that on a local scale, within network connectivity in the brain increases, but in a global sense, the connectivity, the within network on a local scale decreases, but on the global level of the brain, there's this increase in connectivity. And different parts of the brain start linking up and talking to each other in a way they don't do during the sober state. But when the ego, which is considered to be sort of a fundamental, reside within the default mode network to some degree, and be linked to our experience of the sense of self, that when that sort of dissolves under the psychedelic, it seems to facilitate this dissolving of the perception of the barriers between self and other. The concept of self, individual self, and other breaks down, and through that can catalyze this kind of expanded perception then of self nature overlap. And I think that's kind of, particularly if one is in a natural environment, that can sort of leave an indelible, enduring mark, the memory of that experience. So one of the things we know from some of the psychedelic research that's happened so far is that psychedelics are particularly powerful and efficacious when they are combined with pre-existing practices. And this might be spiritual practices such as meditation. It might be therapeutic practices. There's a study by the Johns Hopkins group that looked at psilocybin, high dose psilocybin in combination with journaling and meditation. and found that psychological benefits were markedly enhanced in people that had a practice such as journaling meditation. There's a nature connectedness practice that's found from a few years ago that the simple act of writing 3 things down a day about nature that you love, not that you know, they looked at factual writing as well, it didn't have any effect, but writing a few things a day, 3 things a day for 5 days that you love or find good about nature, elicited a long-term sustained increase in nature connectedness. So I think there's huge potential of using psychedelic administration potentially in nature settings, or even the pre-session preparation or follow-up integration sessions in natural environments, and combining them with the few nature connecting interventions we have that are known to be effective. We can kind of, I think, given psychedelics non-specific amplifying effects, I think they could work very well as nature connectedness enhancing tools in combination with other interventions. I'm currently writing a review paper I'm hoping to submit soon on trying to make a scientific case for the importance and the value of nature-based settings for psychedelic experiences. Nature, being in nature is intrinsically psychologically restorative, kind of feeds into attention restorations theory in terms of the sort of obtaining otherwise depleted resources that have been psychological resources that have been lost through stress or through extended focus, and being in nature, because it gives you that sort of open focus. It's sort of, it seems to be quite soothing on the brain. And coupled with that, there are other positive things like the potential of experiencing awe in nature may be enhanced, or has a number of well-being, even immunosystem boosting and well-being effects associated with it. And so awe might be sort of increased in natural settings. And interestingly, being in natural settings increases global connectivity of the brain in a seemingly similar way, if not gentler way, to what the psychedelics do. So there's even potential for complementary brain states. And then, as mentioned, the potential, I think, of enhancing nature connectedness using psychedelics in natural settings. We know now from the research that, such as some of the depression psilocybin studies, that psilocybin can be really effective for people, and this is people with major depression who've tried numerous other therapies and antidepressants with no luck. But it seems after about 3 months, depression scores start to creep up again for quite a few people. And I feel that the clinical approach, I'm not in any way knocking. It's safe, it's producing lots of good data. It's primarily geared towards people going inwards. And while the setting itself is cozy, people are wearing eye shades, headphones, they're instructed to go inwards and sort of confront what's there. So none of the psychedelic therapy work that's existing at this time is making strong use of an external setting, as far as I'm aware. And I feel like, given the immense amount of data we have on the restorative properties of nature connectedness and nature immersion, by providing psychedelic experiences in nature, you may be able to help form this meaningful bond and connection with nature that can then subsequently be used as a health-promoting, health-buffering resource. And I think this is really important, particularly as we're an increasingly urban species, and for people particularly who haven't had childhood exposure or contact with nature due to circumstance. So I think that there's huge unexplored potential here. In terms of as well, to sort of zoom out to the level of the biosphere, it seems that given that we're in an ecological crisis at this time, this is a quote from a gathering of eco-psychologists around 30 years ago that I think is very relevant to how psychedelics can sort of act as tools of pro-environmental awareness. If the self is expanded to include the natural world, behaviour leading to destruction of the world will be experienced as self-destruction. And Yeah, I thought this is a kind of relevant quote from Gus Speth. Like, we have solid scientific data that we are the scale of like human damage on global ecosystems. We seem very aware of it. And while there is some positive change and reforestation and other initiatives, it seems like still, despite knowing the facts, it's not sufficient to motivate our species to change at the scale and the speed it needs to sort of avert potential ecological disaster. So if the facts alone, if the evidence alone aren't sufficient, then what's it going to take? And so, yeah, that's just something I'm not going to go into too much, but I think there needs to be some kind of change in consciousness, perhaps, in terms of like Albert Einstein said, one cannot hope to change a problem with the same level of consciousness that created it. And that's just a sort of hypothetical thing I'm going to put out there. I'm not going into any more. Albert Hofmann, I'm sure you're all well aware of, one of the grandfather architects of the modern psychedelic era, brilliant chemist and man, discoverer, inventor of LSD, discoverer of the structure of psilocybin. He came to view LSD as or the capacity of psychedelics to connect our species to nature as perhaps their most fundamentally important property. And I personally concur with this. Given where we are as a species in relation to the planet right now, I think this is a sort of, a very important role they can play if used well. And Albert said at the mighty age of 101, a year before he died, alienation from nature and the loss of the experience of being part of the living creation is the greatest tragedy of our materialistic era. It is the causative reason for ecological devastation and climate change. Therefore, I attribute absolute highest importance to consciousness change. I regard psychedelics as catalyzers for this. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Gandy. That was a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
We're gonna open the computer floor up to questions. So if you have a question, just raise your hand and we'll call on you. I guess while we're waiting for some hands, I'll start off. I have a question about just going forward in this research, and about outdoor nature settings. Like, what do you think of the feasibility of doing some sort of controlled trial, but in, say, a clinical setting versus like a clinical setting, but in, say, a conservatory or something like a middle ground, sort of, where you could, you're not going to have animals running in, it's going to be the same plants for everyone, but some sort of controlled trial.
So I think that's sort of a good idea, and it's along the lines of plans that are already being hatched. So the Imperial, I helped set up the Imperial Major Depression Treatment Room with Roz, who I mentioned, and like one of my contributions to Himalayan salt lamps, which make a nice ambience. But Roz bought these really lovely woodland screens, rather like this banner, the background images I've used here in this last slide. So, but like sort of 6 foot tall and all around. So although it was a hospital room for highly immunocompromised patients and its normal day-to-day function, it was actually turned into like a really lovely, cozy and very nature-themed room. So it was really nice. I think, in terms of like comparing natural settings with there is potentially a lot of variables in there. So we're thinking, first I'm thinking of maybe doing a study in the Netherlands where psilocybin truffles are legal. We have a supportive, there's synthesis retreat, there's a few sort of supportive onboard psilocybin retreat places there. We're involved with research as well. So, and synthesis in particular have just moved to a much more nature themed, somewhere with much more nature than where they are at present time, which is a more urban environment near the beach. So yeah, in terms of first studies, the next big scientific thing that needs to happen is we need total control over the settings that people have access to. Because in the previous study, we were relying on people's, like, did you have access to natural settings and were they important for your experience? So self-reporting and no control over the types of settings people having access to. So that's the next thing that needs to be sort of done to sort of increase the scientific rigor. I think if we were going to do a study, we wouldn't actually have people outside in nature quite yet. I think we need to kind of like work towards doing that. And even in the Netherlands, where it's like regulations are much more open to this stuff than the UK, where it's just completely impossible. It's going to take time before doing a proper clinical and then outdoor nature type study. But what we can maybe do is have different groups in different retreat settings, and have some that do the normal synthesis retreat setting, and then others who we managed to like shoehorn a few nature interventions in. So we would take people out into nature before their session. They would would tell them to maybe look for a few natural objects to bring in to their psychedelic session with them. We'd maybe take them out after their session. If we did it in the summer, but by the time we could sort of, when they've sort of come down from that psilocybin experience, we can take them out into nature and maybe do some Shinrin Yoku, some Japanese forest bathing practices or something like that. We might give them a little plant or something to look after, to trip sit for during their trip. We might play, instead of music for a bit, we might play some recorded forest noises, some nature noises or something like that. So there's a few different ideas on how to sort of shoehorn in nature interventions that aren't going to be too sort of turbulent for people undergoing these psilocybin sessions, because we obviously want them to feel comfortable and safe and secure, and we don't want to sort of break the mold too much with synthesis, who we'll probably be collaborating with in terms of their structure. But yeah, so I feel that could be or should be the next study maybe to happen.
Kevin, I'm going to put you on. Kevin, go ahead.
Okay. Hi, I'm Kevin from Horizons. Thank you for the shout out earlier. It was fun to hear.
Hi, Kevin.
So one of the questions I've been having a lot of fun with this year is, as many people now enter the psychedelic community for purposes as diverse as becoming more related to nature, or perhaps becoming a higher performing stockbroker, it's really led me deeper into this philosophical place of what is really an essential effect of psychedelics and what is cultural programming that we layer on top of it. So I'm really sympathetic to this idea that psychedelics can be used to increase nature relatedness, but I also look at some of this, particularly survey research, wondering how large are the biases of the researchers or the kinds of people who are already doing these things.
Yeah.
Data, I'm curious what you see in terms of those kinds of effects where this might be a proxy for having been in a liberal family in the 70s or 80s who went on camping trips.
Yeah.
And then how would you design an experiment that would separate out some of these biases and proxy effects? Because I think it's a fascinating question, whether this is something you can do with psychedelics or whether this is essential to the psychedelic effect.
Yeah. So yeah, psychedelics are many things, and they are non-specific psychic amplifiers, as Stan Grof pointed out. I think there's maybe more to them than that. Like that theory, that sort of view doesn't take into account the ubiquity of fractals in the psychedelic state, but that's a discussion for another time. I would actually say, as apart from like all the various effects people report, I would consider the increased connection to nature that classical psychedelics can engender is pretty much one of their. If you're doing psychedelics in a natural setting, I I think you'd be hard pressed to find many people who didn't report feeling more connected to nature. I know my friend David Luke, with that survey I mentioned before, he said 150 people sort of completed the survey, and every single one of them reported feeling more connected to nature in an enduring way after their psychedelic use, and almost all of them reported more time spent in nature as a result of their psychedelic experiences. So in terms of making the research more rigorous, there's a few different ways of doing that. So firstly, if we were to do a study like this, we would plan it in the sense, so these nature connectedness and relatedness measures are they're quite simple, small measures. They don't take long to do, and it's not like asking a lot of people to do them. So we would plan the study in such a way to avoid expectancy bias. So the people that were being surveyed and assessed wouldn't know that they were specifically being assessed with nature relatedness in mind, connectedness in mind. So that's the first thing. The second thing is we would want to recruit people who rate low in nature relatedness. And so, and also, yeah, I think psychedelic naive people would be good, but also people who are outright low in nature relatedness. So people who have low baseline nature related scores, and that would sort of suggest that they've maybe not had that many childhood, encounters with nature and other things. So can psychedelic sessions with nature interventions, can they increase nature relatedness, connectedness in an enduring way, in a robust way, in people who are, we could say, nature connection deficient? That would be an interesting question to answer, because I mean the people on our study, and this includes the people who had not taken psychedelics, they did have an unusually high baseline of nature relatedness. But an interesting thing is that in spite of that, the nature relatedness measures were still increased by psychedelics. So I think, like, if you accumulate sort of all the existing admittedly limited research together, it does paint a highly compelling picture, I think. Should I be looking?
There's a question in the chat, but I can't seem to pull it up here.
Shall I have a go?
You see it, Sam? Yeah, please.
The little bar thing just sort of disappeared. Let me just
I can read it. I have it up.
Okay.
The question we got was, I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on the significant difference in subjectively perceived nature relatedness between psilocybin and LSD. With phenomenology very similar, might set account for this difference, seeing as psilocybin is plant-based while LSD is not.
Good question. Interesting question. Yeah, and I've really thought about this. So obviously, LSD is certainly an interesting and special compound, but it's a semi-synthetic. It's a child of both man and science, and also nature. I think part of it. So there was a study, and obviously the setting. There was a study by a Swiss group looking at LSD a year or two ago in healthy volunteers, and it interestingly found that a 200 microgram dose of LSD did not yield like an equivalent amount of mystical experiences in the study group as, say, 25 milligrams of psilocybin would. And this is interesting in that the mystical experience is very much correlated with the experiences of ego-dissolution. And ego-dissolution is very much associated with increased nature relatedness. So I think there's a few things going on here. I think psilocybin, it's clearly like an organic substance, and maybe when people are using it, they're sort of eating mushrooms, which that come from the earth. Obviously, like not in the clinical studies, it's all synthetic, lab-made psilocybin, like made to very high purity. So there's still the knowledge that it's an organic compound from nature. But I think personally, I think it's the ability of psilocybin to yield these experiences of ego-dissolution, while also being a relatively user-friendly psychedelic that people will use in nature-based settings. So I think it's kind of there's a bit of an interplay of a few different factors going on that lead psilocybin to seeming to be the sort of pick of the bunch in terms of nature relatedness increase.
Any other questions? I've got another one. So these measures of nature relatedness, so this came from a prospective study. Is there some sort of method that could be applied to all of the psilocybin studies that are going on right now? Basically, just if they wanted to make that as a sub-measure. Yeah.
I mean, I would love that if they were to do that, because it'd be great to get more data on this. But so the measure that we used in our study was the NR6, the nature relatedness 6, and that's actually been used in Robin and Taylor Lyons' previous study as well, in our present study, and it's one of the sort of most widely used, recognized measures in nature relatedness research. And I should say, yeah, just like how that's done. So it's a 6-item measure. There's a 23-item measure as well, but we use the 6-item measure. And it's simply like you ask people in a survey format different questions about their relationship with nature, in terms of where they would choose to go on holiday, how much they acknowledge nature in their day-to-day life, things like this. And they will rate sort of on a sliding scale of like 10. Something like that. So yeah, so which sounds a little bit crude, but I want to give a bit of a shout out to the qualitative side of things here, because it was my friend Ros Rotz's research she sort of figured out this link between disconnection and depression, and that only came through asking people and surveying them qualitatively the 6 months after their psilocybin sessions. No amount of mechanistic neuroscientific brain scans would have revealed that. As important as those mechanistic as the neuroscientific side of things are, like, it's good, yeah, you need to know sort of what's going on in the brain, but it's very important to do the qualitative stuff too. So I just wanted to sort of mention that. But yeah, it would be great to see like these measures apply to more psychedelic studies, because it's only a 6-item measure. It's very quick and easy to do. But yeah, that's an interesting thing to think about, actually. I'll see if I can kind of contact anyone about that.
I'd like to jump in with a question. Hey, Sam.
Hi, Jordan.
Thanks for the talk.
Thank you.
I guess there's sort of a couple of thoughts that were coming up, and I would certainly be interested in collecting some of this in some of the research we're doing here. One of the things that I've thought about, and I know Roz in her group too, we're using acceptance and commitment therapy in our protocol, and we think that a fair bit of what ends up happening might be related to priming and how much psychoeducation is provided. And so, I mean, one of my thoughts was, I think part of your research is looking at just, if you take a psychedelic, do you get more nature relatedness, like sort of just up to chance, or does the setting that you're doing it in matter? But another, if we see this as a valuable outcome, I think there'd be some, one question is whether this can be primed, whether we can actually increase the likeliness of having the increases in nature relatedness through the psychoeducation, as well as the setting and priming that's done ahead of time. So, I mean, that would be interesting to think about, for different, certainly we're more thinking in the clinical populations here, in which populations this might be seen as desirable. Certainly depression, maybe an obvious one. And I guess kind of related to that, I'm just wondering how you think about this in terms of harnessing this increase in nature relatedness amongst clinical populations and as part of clinical interventions versus, on the other hand, trying to boost planetary health and increasing this amongst the broader population. Do you have any thoughts about that, and just how I think I'd want to, on the other scale, I sometimes, at least we've been cautious in this group to not sort of proselytize psychedelics as a sort of a panacea.
Yeah, no, definitely not jumping on the, I think they're a panacea bandwagon. I'll definitely make that clear right now. So a few things. So firstly, as mentioned, in terms of like the priming, one of the issues is there is a lack in the literature. There is a notable lack of interventions of practices that can robustly sort of increase nature relatedness. So I guess you could definitely like prime people in terms of getting them to think about nature in an emotional, loving way. But I think the study I mentioned, where like people simply recorded 3 little things about nature for 5 days, and that sort of robustly increased nature relatedness. So something like that before and maybe a bit after a psychedelic session, I think could be possibly really quite synergistic in a good way. I think like given the regulations, at least here in the UK, like any psychedelic sessions in nature-based settings are a long way off yet. But there's so much more that can be done around that, in terms of like the simple thing of like changing, so making sure that clinical settings have more nature-based things in, like nature-based art and photography and plants and things like that. We know that from the research as well, that one of the things that, from a paper last year, one of the things that predicts challenging psychedelic experiences is self-preoccupation. And self-preoccupation is very similar to rumination. And one of the things nature exposure does is to reduce rumination in the brain. So a simple act, even 10 minutes in nature is enough to lower anxiety and increase well-being. It's quite potent in its sort of mood restorative effect. So by priming, one way of priming people would be simply to sort of get them out into nature as part of their pre-session integration, I think. And then also the other side of the psychedelic experience, try and, where feasible, have integration sessions in nature. There's already a few studies showing that therapeutic interventions are more powerful in nature-based settings than they are in clinical settings. And so there's likely, it seems like nature-based settings are already quite primed for this. So that's sort of one way of kind of looking at it. I mean, like, I'm not sort of, in terms of like the broader biospheric ideas, like, I'm not saying like, let's all just all dose on psilocybin and then we're going to be reborn as a new species tomorrow. And yes, having sort of got to know work in the psychedelic field for a while, I definitely do mostly take the view of them being non-specific psychic amplifiers. Like, it's very much dependent on the person and the set and setting. But I do think this is potentially important, and there are a notable lack of interventions that seem to sort of that might be capable of making people or our species reassess their environmentally destructive behavior. And I'm not saying that like psychedelics are going to be able to do that, but like, I do think used well and with care in the right setting, in the right hands, they could be powerful tools of powerful catalysts of connection, because we are an increasingly nature alienated, disconnected species. And this disconnection is, I agree with Albert, one of the greatest troubles with our materialistic technological civilization. And unless we find ways of reversing that, that is the psychological route to the mass extinction event, I feel, and the global ecological crisis. And unless we find ways to address and reverse that, things aren't going to get better, they're going to get worse. So any more handy potential tools in the box that might be able to help in some way, as small as it might be, I think are very worthy of exploration and looking into.
Thank you.
Sam, I have a question. Thanks for the talk. I'm sort of along the lines of what you were saying before. So we've sort of seen that they can increase people's nature connectedness, but is there any evidence that people sort of change their behavior when it comes to the sort of real trade-offs that one might need to make in terms of changing your diet, changing the amount of international air travel that somebody does, these sorts of real impacts that are needed? Do people actually, they feel connected, but then do they change when it comes to the hard things?
So yeah, no, this is interesting, and this is something that, as part of the next bit of research I hope to be a part of, we will also independently assess pro-environmental behavior changes. So Matthias Forssmann looked at this in his paper, and he did find evidence of people changing their behavior. And yeah, so essentially, like, it's not, there's some evidence for it, but it's like not really being looked at that much. We know that nature connectedness is like a primary sort of association and predictor of pro-environmental behavior, but there's a lack of research looking at these fine-grained changes in pro-environmental awareness. And I'd be really interested to look more into this, because I do know it's anecdotally, but I've encountered numerous people who've used psychedelics and become vegan and vegetarian, and like it was a sudden dramatic change for them, and other sort of changes even in career. I know one of my friends who used to work for the Beckley Foundation, she was, and this is fascinating, I think, because she was a happy, content urbanite. Like, she didn't feel like she was missing in nature in any way. And her first psychedelic experience completely changed her views. She went and did a master's in ethnobotany, and worked in the psychedelic science field. And then she moved out to the country, where she is now, in a lovely cottage in the countryside. And I've know of a fair few interesting anecdotal cases, but definitely not constituting scientific evidence. But I plan to look at this further, because I think it's really interesting and important. Thanks.
We have a question. Have you heard anything about the differences in experience between the forest ecosystem, desert ecosystem, areas?
No, not yet. I mean, this is all very sort of, quite novel stuff in terms of looking at different settings. That's a really interesting question, and it's one of my friends, he's a psychedelic Imperial researcher, Chris Timmerman. He was showing me a photo of, I think, the Atacama Desert, where he was in Chile. And obviously it's a natural environment, but it's devoid in life. So when I think of natural environment, because I know some people, there's the whole thing of like, what is nature? Aren't humans nature, and all synthetic, like modern built environments nature, in a sense? And of course they are, but they still affect us very, very, very differently to, let's say, life-filled environments. So it would be interesting, like, how does being in a forest compare to, say, being in a desert? But then you're going to get different things of like the daytime and then the nighttime, being out under the stars and the awe that comes with that. So it would be interesting in the future to compare different types of natural settings, but I think that's probably some way off yet. But I do think looking at awe and the importance of awe to both the psychedelic state and nature-based settings, like if I could choose to sort of open some kind of nature connection psychedelic clinic somewhere, it would be somewhere pretty naturally stunning. So I don't know, mountains or redwoods or by the coast, somewhere that's sort of like awesome. You know, if you're going to do it properly, you might as well sort of line everything up in a good way.
The second part of this question was, I'm not sure if I heard correctly, but did you say earlier that SSRIs increase disconnectedness?
Yes. Yes, so this was a 6-month qualitative assessment of the patients that came through this study, and it was looking at their sort of baseline feelings, but also their antidepressant usage. And it was interesting in that the SSRI antidepressants did sort of exacerbate or bring about feelings of disconnection. So people reported a numbing. Like it did take the troughs of the really low points away, but it also clipped the peaks and the natural sort of high bits as well. So people were kind of more in this sort of numb middle ground. So people did feel disconnected from their emotions. There was a blunting, an emotional blunting, whereas psilocybin was very different. Like it works through a very different sort of mechanism than that, and it increases connection, and that was an enduring thing. And interestingly, that was even when people's depression came back, the connectedness was still there, and it was a useful resource for people. Even though they were depressed, there was a resilience there that there maybe hadn't been, which is interesting, through this connectedness. And also this acceptance, this emotional acceptance of being able to kind of go into unpleasant emotional experiences that someone with depression may have like pushed aside, and that's the antidepressants will have numbed. So they're radically different approaches to treating depression.
Do you have the name of that study?
Yes, that was Roswatt 2017. It was, I think, connection and acceptance as a mechanism. Let me just find it because I've got it like right here. Oh no, that's not. Here we go. It's just loading. So that study is Watts et al. 2017. Patients' accounts of increased connectedness and acceptance after psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression.
I was wondering if you could speak to this increased nature relatedness and then overarching environmental anxiety and now being more connected with nature and coming to this realization of its peril and how that can
yes, so that's an important point. So there has been a study which I reference actually in the review paper I've been writing, that so this increased nature relatedness is not all just a free lunch in terms of like just feeling psychologically better. As your nature connectedness increases, particularly with relating to self-identification nature and a conservation worldview, there is potential for increased anxiety and feelings, because essentially you're becoming perhaps more aware of the ecological destruction and devastation that our species is inflicting on the planet. So in the sense that might be like a short-term unpleasant thing, akin to actually having psilocybin for depression and coming up against some really horrible feelings. But I think like really horrible feelings that one needs to sort of like explore and process to heal from depression. I think if you zoom out to the level of the biosphere, I think we are going to need to face unpleasant feelings in order to sort of motivate behavioral change. Unfortunately, I don't think having a detached intellectual academic understanding of the facts. It's certainly enough for some people, but it's not enough for many. For I think there has to be a kind of emotional incentive to drive behavior change. I don't think knowledge alone is enough, essentially. And like, I'm aware of what's sort of going on in terms of, I did ecology is my background, but I'm sort of like, yeah, I try and do what I can in terms of supporting causes for ecosystem restoration. That's an area that sort of like gives me motivation in terms of, I do know some high level conservationists, and a lot of them are really depressed and despondent with what's going on in the world. So whereas ecosystem restoration is about restoring what ecosystems we have damaged to sort of for the benefit of nature and humanity. So that seems like I would rather, like, instead of getting anxious about the damage being done, I would rather like put my energy into thinking and writing and speaking and doing stuff on restoring ecosystems instead, personally.
I have one other thought, if I don't see any other hands up there. Any other?
Cool, shoot.
Just regarding, it's just a thought about your possible collaboration with Synthesis in the Netherlands, where it may be possible, a little easier to do some of this. What I was thinking is that, we've been very focused on single dose studies for the most part so far. Maybe there's been a couple 2-dose studies, but I'm imagining when some of the regulations are a little more relaxed, or we can do more research, that this would be a really interesting thing to look at, multi-dose protocol, or maybe actually a crossover study where someone receives, say one group gets psilocybin in the clinical setting first, and then more of the nature part of the intervention, and another group gets it the other way around.
Yeah.
And I think it would just be very interesting, both, obviously in healthy normals, that would be one study to look at just the sequencing, and the other I'm thinking about for more clinical populations where, because I've also thought a lot about dose escalation protocols as potentially a good thing for easing people in initially with very safe and tolerable kind of experiences, and then potentially increasing the dose or changing the setting. And so if we think this may be a piece of treatment, it just would be interesting to see how it could be potentially sequenced into a treatment protocol. So it's maybe something that could be done.
Yeah, that's really interesting. We've got some sort of like study plans sort of in motion now in terms of how we might go about doing it. But no, I like that crossover design sound, but also the multi-dosing study is interesting. I think like definitely there's going to be more potential there if you can provide a few doses across time, and I think hopefully that will be on the cards in the future. I think right now the priority is to sort of get a study in motion that's not going to, hopefully, I don't think will cost too much to do, and sort of get some nice data there, and that will hopefully act as a stepping stone for more ambitious studies like what you've just described there. But no, I think that's a really interesting idea, given that we know from the research that overall lifetime usage of psychedelics has this sort of notable increase. So like, whereas a one-off experience can definitely change things, like the potential for like cumulative effects on nature relatedness is also really interesting to explore, I think, definitely. So I appreciate that. Thank you for sharing.
Not only cumulative effects, but potentially for those patients who maybe do have, the first session being more introspective and processing of trauma or grief and other things like that may be better suited in a clinical setting, and then maybe later being able in a better place to have that more externalized. No,
I think that's also a good point. And, you know, for people who rate low in nature relatedness, I think there's evidence that they may have other issues as an aside to that. I mean, I think like alcohol use it tends to be linked to low NR and stuff like, so yeah, I mean, that's interesting, but as mentioned, I think it's going to be a while, I think, before we can actually go out into natural settings. I think it's going to be primarily a few nature-based interventions during the sessions and either side of the sessions. But no, I think you're right. For clinical populations, it will definitely have to be sort of a secure indoor setting before we have any sort of ideas of like taking people out into natural settings. So I still see that as maybe some way off, but like hope to kind of work carefully towards that, carefully and safely towards doing that, hopefully.
Okay, thanks for doing that work.
Thank you, Jordan. Thanks a lot for your input. Really, really good, really interesting.
All right.
One other question in the chat.
Cool.
The increase in nature relatedness is one of the only measures I can recall that increases over time without maintenance dosing. What do you think accounts for this?
Yes, so this is interesting, and like I don't know how much we can infer from it, but we kind of saw something along those lines with Taylor Lyons' Horizon talk, her data with sort of nature connectedness sort of going up beyond the 3 months. So yeah, it's kind of so firstly, I mean, it's happening over a long time. There seems to be a general increase in nature relatedness over the lifespan, as well as like an positive aging effect on nature relatedness. But I think partly my sort of hunch is, well, firstly, I mean, we've got to look at things sort of like evenly, and that with the prospective survey that was part of our survey, we did have quite a big drop off in total sample numbers between sort of like the month and then the 2 years. So the people who were like reporting back at 2 years, there could be some kind of sampling bias, and the people who feel like they benefited more or more strongly or had high, they sort of had the motivation to complete the survey. So there could be some sort of like sampling bias effect going on. At the same time, so nature connectedness or relatedness is a strong predictor of time and time spent in contact with nature. The reverse is true. There is literature showing that simple contact with nature, it can increase nature connectedness, but as mentioned, not all literature agrees with that, and it's unclear as how transient or long-term that is. But going the other way, nature connectedness definitely does the likelihood of spending time and finding value in nature. So if there is sort of this robust increase in nature connectedness, if nature kind of like comes into focus in a big way for people, then it's likely that people are going to have more time for spending time in nature. And this is something that was really clear from David Luke's sort of first survey study on this whole topic that I saw, that kind of partly ignited my interest in all this, like as well as all people sampled reporting increased connection to nature following psychedelic use. Almost all of them, like 95% plus, all reported subsequent increases in of spending time in nature following that experience. So possibly what's going on is that people are becoming more connected to nature, they're finding more value in it and wanting to spend more time in it, and that's then having a positive reciprocal effect on their baseline nature relatedness levels, which are going up over time because of that, possibly. But yeah, it's interesting.
There was one slide that you presented that had 3 graphs on it. I forgot whose work you said it was, but it was compassion and meaning.
Oh yes.
Life and
yes.
Nature relatedness.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you had any account for why these measures decreased in the control group.
Yeah, so I honestly, I honestly do not know. As you can see, like, so connectedness to nature is essentially, there's no change with the mini dose, pretty much. I mean, it's minuscule. Whereas, yeah, the compassion and meaning of life, there does seem to be this drop off, which is interesting. I think, I mean, the overall sort of scores here, I think, are fairly small in terms of the changes, but it's a good question, and it's one I don't know the answer to, so I'm not going to sort of like try and answer too much. Part of me wonders, like, if people sort of like thought, because they weren't sure whether they were going to, maybe getting the high dose or the sort of placebo, and the placebo in this case is a 1 milligram dose of psilocybin, so it's like a sub-perceptual sort of active placebo. So maybe when they kind of like figured out that they got that, it sort of like they were kind of hoping for a bit more. I don't know though. I mean, that's interesting, but I'm really not sure. I would have to ask Taylor to see what she thinks is going on there, because that's interesting, definitely.
Yeah, that's what I guess I would have guessed that it would be. That's this disappointment, because you hear about people who they really build up to it.
Yeah, I that would be my suspicion. It would be like a disappointment effect there. But yeah, no, I will speak to Taylor and find out about that, because that's interesting.
Mm-hmm. I guess we're about wrapping up here. I just would like to see if you could suggest something. How can people who are in cities, maybe stuck right now, especially during this time, connect with nature? Like, do you have any practices you would recommend to people to be able to help themselves or support their clients who might be stuck inside and not kind of homebound at this time and not really be able to get out and access nature?
Yeah. So I mean, it's tough. I mean, I feel quite lucky here in that I'm quite remote where I am in the Midlands here in England, and I've got access to nature, and that I've really sort of been appreciating that. But it must be tough for people who haven't. And yeah, so I mean, I guess there's a few different things, like even sort of like, harking back to the nature connectingness, the nature connecting enhancing practice I taught about, the things about like recording nature, things about nature that one appreciates, just making a note, even a mental note about other things that people love about nature, even if it's things they've not seen for a while because of the circumstances, because that's all still there and will still be there. So sort of, focusing on the things that give them joy in nature. And also, even if hold up and like, there's, although cities tend to be lacking in nature, there is nature sometimes to be found, and just taking the time, however much time it is, to acknowledge whatever nature, what other forms of life are in your surrounding urban environment. That's really important, something that one could maybe do. Having plants and having pets. Like another thing is you can grow your own. Sounds maybe a bit sort of like random, but growing your own lentils, mung beans, sunflower seeds, chickpeas. You can sprout your own seeds, and they sort of, not only does that sort of grow a super nutritious, super easy to grow food, but you're sort of like, you've got the sort of connection to something that's like living, and you're watching it grow over a few days, and then you're eating it. So you kind of linked some way to natural cycles. I also like, I grow fungi. So lion's mane and cordyceps fungi I've recently started growing, and that's a rewarding, like, interesting hobby that takes up as little or as much space as you want, and it's really quite simple to do, and you can grow your own high quality, like food, health restorative or medicinal fungi at very low cost, and that tunes you into sort of the fungal life cycle, which is a bit quicker than the plant life cycle, which is a plus. And then also taking the time to maybe watch some nature. I mean, there's been research that even viewing nature-based art and images and watching nature documentaries has a powerful psychological effect. Nature is powerful stuff. You don't have to be in the pristine wilderness or even in a park somewhere with a few trees and a lake. Like, simply viewing images of it or being immersed in it that way will have effects on your physiology and psychology. So yeah, I don't know how helpful any of that is, but there's a few. If one is creative, there are a few different things and practices and other things that can sort of tune one into nature in various ways.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, thank you for your time. It looks like we don't have any more questions. Any other further comments, anyone? All right, well, Dr. Gandy, thank you very much. If anyone has any follow-up questions, they can send them to either our email, the YPSG, or Dr. Gandy, your email was up there on that last slide.
Cool. Yes. Yeah. Please do. Nice one. Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's really great to have you.
Thanks, Sam, for your time.
Thanks. No, thanks a lot, Jordan. All the best, guys.
You're in the area in the future.
Cool. Yeah. No. Definitely will do. If I am, that would be nice sometime. Cool. Bye, guys.
Take care, everyone.
Good night.